Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are back for space in the face of the recent situation within the northeast part of the front. It's pretty simple. The space today will go through a couple of issues within the northeast part of the front. Of course, we're going to point out why Cope State doesn't try and point out the changes there, but insist on stuff that did or did not happen. And meanwhile, we're also going to go over a piece recently posted by the Center for Strategic International Studies over next. So, sorry guys, I had a call coming in. So basically, very recently, if you guys didn't check, I posted a couple of things. It seems that we are having a full encirclement on the south, east, and north of the Seversk area. None of this is marked by Cope State, but we have geolocations on the various positions, areas taken by the Russians, like Fedorivka, areas where the Russians are advancing, are getting attacked by the Ukrainians. I posted the very last one today. And we have a gray area north and northwest of Seversk, going towards Derenivka since probably 3 weeks now. But yeah, it is what it is. That area links up with the Serebryanka forest and comes from the Serebryanka settlement beyond the northern Donets River. On top of it, there is a lot of news about Kupiansk. We're hearing from both sides that Kupiansk, especially around the center, is being completely overtaken by the Russians, and that the operation on the Ukrainian side is trying to get from Kupiansk-Vzlovsky towards Petropavlivka, then re-entering on the eastern side, eastern bank actually of the Oskol, and trying to keep it as long as possible, which seems extremely counterintuitive because they have to go through about 20 kilometers under the city to be able to cross, given at least 2 bridges having been blown recently by the Russians. In any case, the operations there are of a lower level, but because the complete disarray of the defensive lines within the salient remaining between Senkove and Kupiansk, we are more or less seeing that Ukrainians are starting to disintegrate within the city, and therefore they're trying to back up south of Kupiansk and trying to, for some reason that I still don't understand, stay in the pocket between, as I said, Kupiansk and Senkove. And then, of course, there is the complete shit show around Yampol, which once again was pointed out by Minoshnikov, I think yesterday, where he said that Syrskyi pretends that there have been stabilizing measures in Yampol, but in reality, there are too many lies. The same thing has happened via Mushnoy, who had put a piece about various lies. Lutsenko also spoke about lies today when he says that there are big lies, small lies, and various levels of danger through these lies. Basically, in any case, for the area specifically, we are hearing a tune that I literally had a space a couple of days before when I said that Cope State is just a symptom of the situation, and the situation is that apparently for some reason we are to the point when I told you guys early in the year that at some point this year the Ukrainians would have to choose a front and let go for parts of other fronts or whole fronts for lack of better alternative. And it seems that they're going to drop Seversk and Kupiansk, and they're going to let the Russians go through a territory, as I said, which politically would be easier to recover without fighting, given that, as I said, Monkey hasn't declared Kharkov Russian territory, which means that, yeah, if there is a peace agreement, Russian troops will have to pull back. And as I said, right now, roughly 1,200 to 1,500 square kilometers. Not that much in the greater scheme of things, but still is territory that, if the political agreement goes through in any shape or form and we stay within the 4 oblasts, although I do not see that happening given what's being said, but I'll speak about that a bit later. Well, it would be easier, quote unquote, for the Ukrainians to recover it instead of fighting over it, and therefore it would make sense for them to let it go as it stands, and instead fighting for other areas and making it more difficult for the Russians. Because what's happening is that literally the point where the Ukrainians are trying to defend themselves is either on small counterattacks in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast or within the area Pokrovsk-Popila, which is not going better, by the way, but just when it comes to Kupiansk and Seversk, we are in a completely different shit show. Now, the biggest issue that I'm seeing within the map and within what is being said by all people is that this situation is not dating from yesterday. We also the Seversk situation getting bad to worse around March 2025, and then those were dismissed as PR ops. We all remember a couple of laughter that Osint had about that, but in fact they weren't. Actually, those forays and those probes were just showing how porous the line was and how badly the Ukrainians were disposed within the Serebrenka forest. And voila, about 3 months after, they started to have seepage, and they actually had lost most of the positions they were allegedly using to defend themselves. Then the Russians pushed over the Zarichne front, and then, I mean, it snowballed to a whole push in 3 different locations, and those were stabilized. Everybody was saying, oh yeah, the bridgehead over the Oskol is nothing, and here we are. Now, the other problem that I'm seeing mostly within pro-Ukrainian Osint right now is that they are going full Russian Voenkorps, Voenkurvas 2022. And this is very complicated for me because I stopped visualizing the war like this since roughly June 2022. We're all super happy to have those situations where everyone would, in a certain sense, be happy and in good spirits, and the Russians were advancing, actually. I don't know if you guys remember the battle for the Donets River, although it had turned pretty badly with the failed crossing at Dronivka. We ended up in that situation where still advanced to Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, got those, and nobody was expecting the quote-unquote operational post that would actually transform the attack from those 2 points towards Bakhmut and Soledar. And meanwhile, the 2 major catastrophes in this war happened. First of all, the Russians failed to properly beat back the Kherson attempt around Davidov Brid, and then, a month later, after the start of that one, we had the Kharkov debacle, and the situation that we are having right now, which is and that's why I want to come, the fact that Western patrons of Ukraine were emboldened to go beyond the vision of a hit and run campaign against Russia. So basically, try to get Russia out of big centers and then starting to grind it out through smaller battles and force the Russians to probably around the month. That's why Milei said that November was the best moment to have a discussion with the Russians, have a deal when the Ukrainians were in a better position, and then end, quote unquote, the war in a certain sense. So have a kind of Minsk 3, probably in worse shape for the Russians. Politically, the Russians would have probably had to make a lot of concessions regarding Donetsk and Lugansk, which ironically by end March, Putin was ready to make. He was ready to throw them both under the bus for as long as he could keep Crimea legally. Of course, it's not that simple, but still, let's not beat around the bush. The conditions early March were far more drastic, although there was no recognition of the two Donbass areas. The conditions of March were still more drastic because it required from Ukraine to reject NATO, to have a very small army, which would allow the Russians to come back if there was some funny business going on. But of course, that was rejected simply because once what I said, the major strategic failure that Russia had from the beginning of this war. Actually, when I'm speaking this, I'm speaking about 2003, as I more or less put it down to one of the spaces a couple of weeks back, when I said that unfortunately the Ukrainians were into this path of chauvinistic nationalism shared with Russians in a certain sense, where they would take advantage of bigger rivalries and then would just put the cape of, the downtrodden little body that needed to be saved by the valiant Uncle Sugar. In any case, Ukrainians, the moment they saw that their partners would help them, of course, they didn't know at that point how this help would develop in 23, 24, and now 25. But initially, the type of help they received, the type of campaign that they could inflict on the Russians, literally made it easy. So the problem that we soon saw at that point was that the Russians were unprepared. But this we knew by 2022. And this unpreparedness led to crazy losses, led to a misconception on what they were fighting. One of the problems that I saw since the beginning, I told you guys, is that the army that was allegedly put in shape by the Russians for this war was a lean, allegedly mean army that was supposed to fight an enemy that they were overmatching, which is normal. It's absolutely normal. The issue is that they weren't fighting the Ukrainians alone. And that's a failure not of the intelligence element within the army or whatever. It's a failure of the political element. This is where deterrence was already gone to shit, because nobody saw anyone try to help Iraq. In any case, in 2003, there were consternations, there were a lot of yapping, especially by Germany and France, but nobody dared do anything about it. No Russia, no China, nothing. Same thing if the Americans decide to go after Afghanistan for reasons that, once again, you may agree and disagree, but like nobody actually even thought twice about the Americans waging war to a country like Afghanistan. Similarly, nobody tried to stop anyone, even the Russians put themselves aside when it came to Libya. And more recently, with the shit show going both in Gaza, in Yemen, and the Israeli-Iranian fighting, still nobody dares. That's the deterrence that the Americans still possess. The Europeans, nobody would care. But America itself, you can understand how it works. So that was the major strategic failure, the sense that the Americans, from the beginning, they didn't care about who was in front of them. The only, I think, logic that would go for Russia at that point is that we're going to overrun the Ukrainian army, So the only thing the Americans could do basically is to help some kind of underground movement or resistance movement on the western bank of the Dnieper. That thing, of course, sailed. The Russians pulled back because they saw that they would lose too much by keeping that high tempo operational level. And in my opinion, now, that's why I said, if I have to rethink the whole point, maybe the Russians should have bitten the bullet a bit longer, a couple of months more, because a posteriori we saw that if the Russians were still around Kiev, even with the huge losses, some of the equipment, some of the elements that came within Ukraine for repelling the Russians beyond that, so basically the south in Kherson, well, they came way after, it was evident that the Russians were not going to be quickly overtaking the Ukrainian army for a plethora of reasons. Let's not discuss it. So this is the foundation ground where from a lot of analysts, pro-Ukrainians especially, are basing things that the following article that I'm going to discuss. In a certain sense, and of course, we're going to go to the Tomahawk question, but once again, as I said, I do not think that Trump is going to give the Tomahawks, not because he doesn't want or whatever, simply because even him knows that going there would take out that condition, I think, that was discussed in a way or another between Biden and Monkey, that leaves the bridges and some of the most precious power generating units within Ukraine untouched. You start giving strategic weapons to the Ukrainians, we're going to go strategic on them. And I think the proxy war, both sides more or less laid out from 2022 up to 2024, regarded that we're going to fight this shit left and right, but we're not going to go after things that could completely alter the nature of Ukraine as a country. Yeah, of course, I understand. There's an annexation. Don't take me wrong on that. The point was still keeping that shit in one piece, because at some point you will have to normalize relations. And that thing from 2022 went on to a point when today it makes no sense, given what is being said and sustained by Trump, and what is not being said and sustained by Trump. So, for instance, when he said, "Yeah, I pretty much made the decision, but I want to know." So once you analyze this from that point of view, now with Trump making eruption in that scheme that was more or less well set, then you understand that Trump, as I said, is this maverick, and he could very well give Tomahawks. But then at the same time, Biden announced JASM, or at least long-range missiles, and these never came. It's over 1 year. And on top of it, it makes less sense to give Tomahawks instead of giving JASM, because the major sites that you need to bomb for the Russians to start understanding the problem are not 1,300 kilometers away. Some of the things that you can completely blow up, like refineries, they're within 600 kilometers. So you give them JASM extended range, it's going to work. Now, as for Tomahawks, I said, if it's the 1K, 1.6K, you're going to put a lot of things within target, including, of course, Alabuga. The problem of those, as I said, is that you are putting a strategic weapon into the hands of a crackhead, because Ukraine right now is a crackhead. And first of all, you're going to pretend that you have control over the targeting. Yes, because that would mean that you'll have troops on the ground. there is a logic of belligerency which I really don't think that Trump wants. And of course, Trump is an asshole. So the Soleimani case, what happened with Iran, like the guy is a fucking asshole. So trusting him is a no-go. Therefore, as I said, it would have to be regarded as co-belligerency from the get-go. It doesn't matter what he says, doesn't matter what people try to fabulate over it. Trump is, if there is a Tomahawk strike, Americans armed that shit, Americans transported that shit, and Americans are guarding and transiting that shit. It is an American attack on Russia. I'm not saying that Russia is going to defend it at least, but they're going to see it like that. There is no other way. And I joked today with a couple of guys that, of course, Yemeni Bulavas fired from the Barents Sea is going to be just the same. So I do not think after, especially what Trump said at the end of this exchange over the Tomahawks, where I said, I do not wish escalation. You cannot talk about escalation and Tomahawks in the same phrase with a negative. Unless you say, I will not give Tomahawks because I don't want escalation. But if you say, I have made a decision, I want to know what they want to hit with it, but I don't want escalation, it's completely crazy. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. But they're not alone on that. I mean, Trump is just a retard, so on that aspect, it's completely normal that he would play these games. And in a certain sense, what Trump is doing, and honestly, that's how you see that America carries the stick within the Western world, not Europe. Macron tried to do this bullshit strategic ambiguity over, oh, I'm thinking about sending guys over there. I'm like, what the fuck are you even talking, bro? You cannot even transport your ass to fucking Romania, not sending a brigade or two in Ukraine. But when Trump says this stuff and makes these remarks, which are strategically ambiguous, let's face it, everybody listens. And this is the power of America, and this is the difference between America and Europe. Merz yapped a lot about the towers. When he had the chance to actually give it, we're waiting. Merz is chancellor since March 2025. We are in October 2025. So let's count it. Let's say March too early, right? April, May, June, July, August, September. 6 months, half a year. No towers. And then Merz backtracked and said, okay, towers is not really on the agenda because we need to that. And so basically, he ate his words. The problem is Trump is not eating his words. And even if he's eating his words, he doesn't care. But that means that there is a fucking possibility that he would send the Tomahawk. And there we go back with what I said. The only thing that matters in this war is what America is going to say and what Russia is going to do. And what America is going to do and what Russia is going to say. This finishes to cement the real deal about this war. If you want to understand where, how much, and who, there you got it. It's the US talking to Russia, threatening it, and Russia talking back to the US, threatening to actually fuck the Ukrainians up. Now, there are other things that are happening. France, as I said, tried to seize a cargo, then had to let it go because the reasons were bogus. Now there's discussion about finding a way to legally start stopping the quote-unquote shadow fleet tankers, which once again is fully illegal because there is no such thing as a shadow fleet. Russia employs vessels for fuel transport or trust third parties with their fuel transport, which means customers trust Russia or the third parties with the fuel transport. In order for Europe to try and find any kind of argument to start blocking the Russians from using any channel or naval passage that is under phone, so basically freedom of navigation, they will have to actually state and start stopping every single boat. You cannot start singling out specific destinations because, once again, as I said, that would mean that Europe is singularly pointing out specific destinations, which is not okay with the law of the sea. And of course, nobody cares in practice. They're going to still do it if they want to do it. And this would go back to a back and forth, either with the Russians having a naval escort for a bunch of tankers, or the Russians answering in another way, which is, it's too fucking sad. You just ate a short-range ballistic missile with your fucking fuel coming out of the Red Sea. We don't know what's going on. Maybe it's related to Palestine. Things happen. And thank God, a lot of the oil you guys are buying is from tankers, from an area that we could use to launch shit on your ships. And of course, this would be a problem, because you would need whose boat is going. But we saw that the Houthis are good enough with that when it comes to what goes through and what is right. And, it's not going to be a huge problem. They're not going to start shooting every single ship, but just enough so you would stop doing your bullshit. The whole idea of the escalation at sea from the European Union, in this case, has a backdrop that is huge, because unlike Russia, the European Union is far more dependent on sea lanes, on shipping. And some of these sea lanes, some of this shipping is vulnerable to actions of pirates. Bad guys. And things will happen. Because it's not who? It's not America. Exactly. So then we're going to have a potential solution for the Europeans, which is stop buying that much from places around there and buy from the US. Could be a solution. But that means that you're going to ruin a lot of people. The Gulf is going to start feeling it. I have no problem with that, At the end, Europe getting fleeced by the Americans for a European conflict that Europeans should have been the arbitrators of and find a solution that would suit both of these nations. No, they chose to be vassals to the US, slaves, and that's what it is. So, as I said, Europe is not a subject here. Europe is just a thing. It doesn't really have agency to that. And when they try to do things, it backfires spectacularly. But that's not the problem here. All this is just to put out the kind of stuff, strategic areas where we would be having this situation with the Western partners, and to point out how even when Europe can do something strategic, the backblast of that, the recoil of that, because there are other stuff that might happen, by the way, especially if the Europeans want to choke point the Russians at the Danish Strait. They could choke point a lot of guys there. As I said, you just go through with a cargo that's perfectly inspected and insured and everything, and you just make it blow within the straits. Let's see how much fun the guys over there have to clean up the stuff and restart navigation and trying to stop another such thing from happening. That's the thing with choke points. It works both sides. It's like a fucking tracer. And I'm pretty sure that the Finns are going to be delighted over that. Half of the German shipping that goes through it, and the Polish shipping. It's very exciting. I love when people, and if you want to know why I'm saying this, is because the Estonian chief of staff, when he said that intercepting the Russian planes is going to be a strategic mistake for Estonia, he was thinking about this as well. Estonia is right now utmost depending on fucking LNG and fuel transport by sea, which is the most choke pointable ever. So once again, there are chihuahuas and there are big dogs. It's the same thing that we spoke about for the Russian funds. All this is a very funny ploy to bring back Europeans as relevant in this conflict. But as you see, if America reduces any kind of help, intelligence sharing, training, pressure on Russia and to Ukraine, then things start to go south very fast for Ukraine, because they are on that brink right now. And on a certain sense, all this yapping that we're hearing right now is coming to a very specific point that I'm going to link up with what's going on the field. Kupiansk might well be gone by the end of the month. Seversk might also be gone by the end of the month if the Ukrainians are not able to do anything about it. With the current geolocation as Konstantinovka, the shaping is not complete, but we are going there. And while everybody has the Dobropila / Poltavka double salient there a bit dormant right now, I'm not sure that things are that way. I'm really seeing a couple of things that Ukrainians, at least for today, have stopped talking about that area. If you stop talking about that area, what does it mean? Why the silence? They kept boasting about we advanced there, we choked there, we defended there, we won there. For a whole fucking month. 15th of August to 15th of September. 3 cauldrons, 5 cauldrons, surrendering people, they're starving. We had articles literally saying this. We are slowly going to 2 months of counter. And I told you guys, over those 2 months, the Russians had liberated more area from Ukrainian control in Kursk than what Ukrainians had to block the Russians for, to block them. Not even liberated, just, restrain them. So this is the funny part. What's really going on? What's going on? The threats, the escalate to de-escalate that we're hearing from Trump seem to me that the Ukrainians are pleading for something to stop the onslaught. Because they're trying a lot of things. Cope State said that in September only 200 something were earned, 259 I think square kilometers. Then even their own faggots came out and said, that's more like 400, bro, stop lying. And then when we calculate everything, and I'm going to post 2 pictures because I need you guys to understand how funny the whole thing is with the Ukrainians. So on the upper end, neither Seversk alone, we have about 100 square kilometers that are either taken by the Russians or should be gray zoned. You can see on the map, I just posted them, that they're not. Most of the area I just pointed out is allegedly Ukrainian controlled. We have seen the Russians actually in those positions, I said, either controlling them or getting bombed around them. So as I said, either gray, either red, but they cannot be blue or yellow in peace. And a lot of things are going like this. A lot of things will go. We keep going for the Ukraine like this. They're gonna start lying over who's advancing where. We have Syrskyi saying we liberated or cleared over 300 something square kilometers. And I'm like, for fuck's sake, the Russians never took that much. But even though, had they taken this much, we still have them over 120 kilometers within the salient. And they are pushing on the other side. You had, I'm gonna say, you have a third ear pulling up, although it's not really an ear. In Kupiansk, you are supposed to have enabled powerful countermeasures about 3 weeks ago, over 3 weeks ago. You're getting raped. Like, what the fuck's going on? And I think all these started to point together, and the non-stop losses they're getting, especially in artillery and tanks for a side that is defending itself, make me feel that, in fact, this escalation, this scare tactics employed by Trump right now, are simply taking into account the very thin resistance threshold from the Ukrainian side. And they are there to give the impression that it's not about a strategic vision on the long term, we're going to bomb Balabuga, we're going to bomb Kerch or whatever. No, it's there to make the Russians start pause and reflect over what's going to happen if I release the hounds of war, let's say it like this. The problem is that Trump, as many other people, don't understand Russia. Why Russia is fighting this war. So we're going to start the article, which is by the Center of Strategic International Studies, and it's called Russia's War in Ukraine, the next chapter. It's two idiots, but whatever. I'm going to put the link in the space. You can read it. So, Western diplomatic efforts to negotiate a ceasefire with Moscow have repeatedly failed, showing that despite the immense costs Russia has borne since 2022, its goals in Ukraine remain largely unchanged. And I'm like, first of all, no, the goals of Russia and Ukraine do not remain unchanged. They have changed completely. Initially, what we saw from Russia was a kind of police action, get inside, beat the shit out of whoever, maybe depose or not depose the guys, have a deal with the new government or the previous government that would like surrender to enable a series of changes that would be indeed limiting the sovereignty of Ukraine. But it wasn't about conquering Ukraine. The presentation about conquering Ukraine is, in my opinion, far removed from reality, given what Russia tried to do at the beginning of the war and how many people were employed for this task. But after what happened in Kherson, but especially in Kharkov, Russians went, just fuck it. Let's go full on, annex those places, legalize the occupation into a form of land grab, and let's fight for this. So from the beginning, that's why I told you guys, there is a complete misunderstanding of the war, a misrepresentation. And this, of course, I'm going to repeat, you're going to feel it back during the article. They know actually that they're wrong. They know exactly why they're making it about Russian objectives being unchanged, while in fact Russia has seen its objectives both change with the cost that it will have to bear. Annexing another country or another country's territory is still a big no-no within the current UN chart. It can be done after a war. In a certain sense, secessionist movements are just a different form of this, because it's military action / political violence that enables a piece of territory from country A to be either independent or given some kind of independence by another military power or another bunch of nations. I'm looking at Kosovo, of course, but not only that. So Russia took, in my opinion, politically the least defensible role. Why? Because this hits the wrong way with China, which are having their own shit with Taiwan, and also hits the wrong way with Serbia in a certain sense, because, like, you're going for an action, so basically the violent change of borders is not sacred, like it's not a big no-no, so you're doing it, we're going to have that problem as well. And in reverse, people in Kosovo are going to say, see, you guys let that go, so who are you to judge us? It's immensely more difficult on that legal aspect to present this as something positive. But in a certain sense, I don't care, because everybody is a subject within international law, so they can technically do that. There is nobody stopping you from doing that, actually, despite the UN, whatever. If the country can get away with it in a certain sense, look at America, of course it will happen. Now, with these factors in mind, this brief outlines 4 most plausible scenarios for the trajectory of war: Russian breakthrough and collapse of Ukrainian military, prolonged low-intensity conflict, ceasefire, and a peace agreement. The brief assessed the likelihood of each scenario as well as strategies for Ukraine and the West to maximize favorable outcomes. In all scenarios, shifting the balance and ending the fighting will require sustaining significant investment in European and Ukrainian defense industries to maintain Ukraine's frontline forces, protect cities from missile and drone attacks, and project force into Russian territory through long-range strikes. So, this part we've already heard. Basically is that we are into an attrition war. If we let go Ukraine, they're going to lose, so we need to sustain them for as long as it takes. So basically to the last Ukrainian in this case. It's a meme, but you're going to see it's not actually a meme. So we're now September 25. Russia war in Ukraine has dragged on for 3.5 years, despite 9 months of efforts by the United States to end the fighting. Bullshit. There was absolutely no effort to end the fighting. Absolutely not. The President of the United States came there a bit like Cyrus the Great and said, kiss the fucking ring and make peace. That was probably the worst way to tackle it. But as I said, he's a douchebag, so it's completely normal he would do that. He's a fun douchebag, though, so I'm going to tell it. It's the fun part remains, and the fact that he hits certain nerves remains as well. As I said, he shows what actual strategic ambiguity is, whereas Macron, the weak, cannot even fucking hold a government for more than a year. But must be political ambiguity, whatever. So, there was been a flurry of activity from talks in Saudi Arabia to Oval Office meetings. Those talks, they were not regarding the Russians. They were literally Western morons talking to Ukrainians on what they're going to ask Russia to do to stop the war. So basically, from the beginning, especially when the Europeans started yapping, is that there had to be a just and equitable peace, or what the fuck. My bro, the just peace you're looking for would mean that Russia gets the fuck out, despite everything they spent, the blood and treasure they spent, let completely Ukraine get into NATO, get NATO missiles troops at the fucking border that we've seen is even worse than having I'm sorry to say it like this, is worse than having your whole population have AIDS. That's the beauty of this. NATO troops at your doorstep will make any kind of calm, rational decision-making for the Russians within a century impossible. And the only way they can defend from that is to just go within the Chinese sphere of influence as a junior partner. Right now we're speaking about Dragon Bear, but in reality it's going to be much simpler than that. The Russians, as they stand, completely cut off the European market, have no other choice. There is no third way. The third way was having good relationship with both blocs and being the bridge. There was literally the railway going through Russia towards Europe. But with the way the Western world made the decision, which is kiss the ring or fucking roll over, I'm sorry, there's nothing to discuss anymore. It's going to be a Russia-China alliance / fusion, and that's it. For a lot of people who have a very right-wing view on what Russia is, the trads and the base guys know what is being prepared from descriptions like this is literally pushing the Russians towards the Chinese and preparing the groundwork for intercontinental actually / world war based on the primal fear of a whole continent, which was the main driving motor of the European continent until it rose to its preeminence, was that it was afraid of getting invaded and controlled first by the Muslims, then actually first by the Mongols, the Huns, Muslims, then the Mongols. So the East scared the Western Europeans. And what we're having here is not some kind of higher form of culture against a lower form of culture. And I'm saying this, I'm going to tell it as a part of that European culture. What we're having here I'm going to repeat it, we have a paranoia and a self-deluded mentality of the European continent that somehow their values are above everyone else because they managed through violence to get the top spot back in the day, and they shape much of the world to their view. Once you accept this worldview, you have a huge problem because all your bullshit about human rights and international institutions goes to shit. What you did is you pointed a gun to different people, you make them work for you. You got that riches, that treasure, invested it through a ideological form, a paradigmatic form, also higher understanding, due to, unfortunately, also violence. Or fortunately, depending how you see it. But on another aspect, there is nothing, especially once you look towards the Asian cultures, there is nothing that makes them inferior except your own preference. There are things that I cannot do. I cannot go like the Koreans working for 20 fucking hours, have no life, have no kids, and fucking roll over and die as a nation just because I want to show everybody that I can do it better by basically becoming a fucking human robot. But that's also who we're going against as Europeans when it comes to scientific achievements, productivity, and the logic. Poor, hungry people getting up, realizing that getting to a certain level is not enough. They have to one-up us. That's what it is. The issue, though, is that our answer culturally as Westerners has been to look at them through the lens of 200 years ago. They're inferior, they cheat, they lie, they steal. For fuck's sake, you did the same. the biggest problem, especially with Europe, is that we completely forgot, or we rewrote our history and made ourselves into some kind of ethnic/genetic nobility that it has no foundation. There is no genetic about it. What it is our political will, our machinations, and our violence, the applied and organized violence we managed to do, dealing between us. A lot of people, when you point out this within the Jid community, they point out this as why they not liked, but this is the same kind of shit happened at the higher form between Western powers. The world was shared among, sorry to say it like this, a Western type of culture, despite the fact that one of the guys who shared it was a fucking Georgia. And allegedly communist, but that's something else. So what we're seeing destroyed today is the remnant of that power sharing. By kicking Russia to the curb and sending it back to, quote unquote, its Asian roots, we're destroying whatever was the white/Western dominated world, and it doesn't matter what you think. This is what's going on right now. And when you read these articles, you understand why we're losing it. And why I also named the fucking space Dunning-Kruger. Because there is absolutely no logic to what you're going to read. Read the article on yourself. So, as the negotiation with Russia initiated by Trump remains stalled, with Putin in a sense refusing to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky outside Moscow, and the situation at the front line remains fluid, it's not. The situation at the front doesn't remain fluid, and Zelensky himself initially started 22, 23, 23, 24, and 24, 25 by saying he will never negotiate with Monkey. The only thing that makes Zelensky start to call for a peace, for peace talks, is because his fucking gambit in Kursk failed. It failed so badly, it backfired so badly that what you're seeing today at the front line is those results. And instead of owing the fucking shit show, Zelensky is trying to change the rules of that own game by doing what? Very simple. Zelensky is trying to just throw up the table. No rules anymore. You know, for so long, Russia could have fucking blown up the NPPs. I'm not doing it. Now I'm going to start attacking the Russians that I have enough long-range vectors. And I'm like, bro, nothing will change on short term in your advantage. Even the bullshit with the refineries. What's going to happen to you, though, is that you only have so many bridges that will go down. And I'm going to repeat it. The escalation that Zelensky is seeking, and he says it himself, oh, Russia should stop bombing, will not do it because we're defending ourselves. The mentality that goes behind it, the victimary vision, and also the absolute shit show of the pretense that somehow Trump was aiding these quote-unquote peace negotiations show exactly where we are and how badly the West is equipped for a global fight after this war. We are still thinking that we can absolutely push everybody around, and to a certain sense, the West still can for a lot of players. Until it gets to the hard point. And this is why this article is very baseline and so crudely written to make you understand. So in short, Russia believes it is winning the war of attrition. It is not believing it. They are winning it the way it's fought right now. And that it can overpower and outlast Ukraine. Should Russia conclude that it cannot fully win and that destroying Ukrainian military and toppling Ukraine's democracy is impossible, quote unquote, there is no democracy in Ukraine as we stand. The guy ruling Ukraine right now has exceeded his term. He cannot have elections because he enabled a state of emergency within Ukraine, and on top of it, he is doing everything to turn Ukraine into a fucking banana republic. Moscow will super peace. Instead, the next best options for Russia is likely a forever war waged at a lower, more stable intensity. That's not the problem. Russia doesn't want to wage a lower intensity war. What Russia is waging right now is literally an economy war, which is costing Ukraine fucking its future. I already posted some glimpses of a Zona Wa article over the huge problems of deficit that Ukrainians are going to have. And more or less what Ukraine would need within the next 2 years is the whole bullshit plan they're trying to pass as reparation fund from Russia to Ukraine paid in advance before even the war has stopped. Why? Because the cost for Ukraine to wage war as a baseline deficit is going to touch roughly 120 billion if the war goes the way we're seeing it go. So this means that the prospects of Kremlin seeing any diplomatic breakthrough are extremely low. The West needs to operate accordingly. That's not true. Trump himself initially was talking with some kind of option when Monkey said, 4 oblasts, these little things, let's go. And then Monkey even said, you know what, the EU perspective for Ukraine, no problem, they can do it. NATO, no. EU, I don't really care. When you analyze it, this is going to be the best deal Ukraine will ever get. The longer this war will go, the longer Ukrainians are going to die. And if the signs we're seeing are really related to the fact that Ukraine is not making progress on the ground, but is slowly eroding its potential also to defend, not only to defend and locally counterattack, but literally to defend every spot. If the weight is going in Kupiansk, Seversk, and the pushes that we're having through Yampol and Liman are what is actually going for the rest of the fucking front, that they're forced now to patch by concentrated assets in very visible, PR-like, and sustainable also areas, then the problem is not if Russia wants or not to sue for peace. Russia is going towards its objectives, and I already explained this. One of its objectives, the strategic objective, is to make sure that Ukraine will not try anything anymore in Zaporozhye. And in order to achieve this, the wall that we had last year at the same time beyond Ugledar now is going to close in and maybe take over Huliapolye for the middle of December. And this would mean that you will have a 60 plus gross area of maneuver, and in net, because it needs to be within the two. Sorry guys, I need to just show you because it's very, very, very important. So yeah, these two small things here. I just posted another 2 maps so you can understand. If you have these 64, 70 gross maneuver areas in Zaporozhye, instead of the almost 200 linear kilometers you had in 2023 and still failed, this means that in any case, Ukrainians are going to be forced to focus their efforts within that narrow band of maybe 55 linear kilometers of front. But it also means that they will need to pack that area all around it with their reserves in order to push, which means that the damage at the onset of any kind of counteroffensive within Zaporozhye is going to be completely nuts. You're going to have a UNPK fiesta to a point that you've never seen, and the Ukrainians will have to start committing their newly acquired air force in any kind of cap, CAS, whatever. Which means that in order to try and have this, they will need to go through way more than simply the preparation that we saw in 2023. They will need to start a SEAD campaign all over Zaporozhye, and of course will need to have something to deter the Russians from launching within 700, 800 kilometers their Su-34, the Su-30 and Su-35. Now the problem with all this is, of course, the Russians might, of course, refuel in air, which the Ukrainians for the moment cannot do. None of the current planes that I've received, maybe the Mirage 2000, but that's another shit show, can do it. Those are primary one-way ground assets. You fuel on the ground, you fly, drop tanks, whatever, you go back, you refuel, you go up. Plus the frames are unfortunately old, so it's better not to try that shit. But once you analyze it like this and see that on a macro level, Ukraine cannot achieve what it wants in order to force Russia at the negotiation table or out of Ukraine, shortly said, then the only thing that remains, and I discussed this previously, is going to be the long-range campaign. A long-range campaign, there you got the Tomahawk, so it even makes sense that Trump would propose it, not simply to be ambiguous, but also to actually pose a threat to the Russians. But then, as I said, you have the escalation ladder, and then bridge is going to probably blow up, some kind of NPP accident will happen, and you're going to have also attacks on ships that go to Ukraine. Because at that point, you are out of red lines. I'm sorry, at that point, you just engage into unrestricted naval warfare for a week or two, completely starve Ukraine for its exports, and then you just say, fuck it. There is no much to be said there. You entered the phase that you wanted to avoid with the Tomahawks, if they get delivered, of course. So what is there to defend or to depend on? Nothing. So what does Putin want? Well, the war has strayed from Kremlin's initial plan. I told you, they admit themselves that the initial plan is not the same. Putin's core objectives appear unchanged. That's not true. Putin literally has annexed land that he didn't want to do. Crimea was referendumed, quote unquote. Here, we didn't have the same thing. In Crimea, there was a vote. You can pretend that it wasn't genuine, whatever, but there was a fucking electoral process. In those 4 oblasts that were seized, I mean, it was a joke. I'm the first guy to tell it. You maybe not be happy with me. It was a joke. It was purely annexion, and I have no problem with it. I told you why. There was a plan. This plan was mostly to keep Ukraine intact, but still connected in some form. Ukraine refused it. Price went up. As simple as that. Strategically, Kremlin remains determined to subjugate Ukraine and prevent it from aligning with the West. Bitch, there is nothing to align with the West with. We just want, I'm speaking for Putin here, no fucking troops, no fucking alliance with anyone else. Because with a no alliance situation, you got this shit show. Now imagine if Ukraine is in NATO. You'll have to go nuclear from the get-go. As simple as that. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in early September, Putin reaffirmed his goal of addressing the root causes of the war, Kremlin defense for replacing Ukraine. Nah. Putin would happily leave Zelebobik on the spot because Zelebobik is the worst enemy of Ukraine as it stands right now. Why would Putin try and remove Zelebobik anymore? That guy literally is grabbing people from the street. He is not elected anymore. Everybody knows that he's trying to protect his minions from stealing public and Western funds. The Flamingo story is the funniest one of all. There are corruption scandals since the war started that have never been addressed. The guys who get the fall for corruption are always lower idiots. You got huge units who are indulging into scam centers, which are now also a full part of the SBU and the GRU, the Hur, sorry, who is the Russians. They are employing tactics and methods to kill their own citizens for not being okay to stay with Zelebobic. There is no discussion here about democracy or freedom or whatever. What is, since probably 2024 already with the invasion of Kursk, Ukraine has shed his role as a kind of defender, because I already explained this. The moment you go and you invade Kursk without a defensive purpose, Zelia said it, I'm not going to Kursk because I want to keep the country or whatever. I'm going to Kursk for bargaining chip. So you basically are dealing in the same way as Monkey. Because Monkey does the same when he goes to Dnipropetrovsk or to Kharkov. He's like, if you keep yapping, I'm going to grab more land. You align yourself with Monkey, so there is a competing interest with the same method. And then when you lose it, there must be some kind of way to pay for it. Zelebobic is not paying for anything anymore. Zelebobic goes out there and say, I did this, we did that. Everybody tells him, bro, you're lying. This is bullshit. You cannot say this. The Ukrainian authorities have been going from some small lies understandable in times of war, Ghost of Kiev, all that bullshit, into literally inventing capabilities that are on par with the Soviet fucking Union. The Bogdana situation, we're making 40 of them per fucking month. I'm like, bro, the Soviet Union was making 600 jets and guns per year. You were making allegedly 480 with your capacity. We are into something that is going beyond Dunning-Kruger. The West with Ukraine has, unfortunately for me, went to where I cannot fucking, consider this benign or some kind of war necessity. What they're doing is they're letting someone invent a reality, back it. We all remember the 1 million casualties. Like, we're going to a place where what the West said about Russia, that Russia was trying to sow confusion in order to avoid having the real discussion, the West is doing the same. They're sowing the same confusion. And the problem is that once you start analyzing it from that point of view, you understand that the whole discussion about what Russia wanted to do to our democracies for 10 years is exactly what they are actually doing on a basic daily situation to other countries to obfuscate the real problems that they have with them. For instance, with China, there is nothing about human rights. I'm not saying that Chinese have a perfect record of human rights. Don't start talking about that. I'm saying that the insistence on human rights, on this, on that, on other parties, have nothing to do with human rights. They have to do with a competition which the West has engaged into without having the proper tools. Because for a long while, they dominated them, and it was completely normal to just ask and receive. Now things have changed. Now the whole critical mass that was relying on economical multipliers, that were the research, the patenting, the IP, and everything, has gone away industrially. Both poles of the West, America and the EU, are getting stripped of their assets. The whole bullshit about overcapacity with China has nothing to do with overcapacity. There is a certain form of overcapacity. But you started this shit. They are just beating you on your fucking game. So get better, or I don't know, go to war to stop them. Just don't start this protracted, shitty Cold War that now you cannot win, because one of the biggest issues that the Soviet Union had at the end of the Cold War, quote unquote, was that they were the has-been guys. Up to the end of the 60s, with everything that was going on, the space race, and the fact that both sides were growing, it was starting to look like, okay, the Soviet Union was stalling and the West was growing. Then you had the oil crisis in 73, and then what happened? You had a slump on both sides, which was in a certain sense politically marked by the Vietnam situation for the US, and then the Soviet Union just got itself into that stagnation and decay, while the West propped itself via a ballooning Ponzi scheme, created this literal, bubble effect on its economies, and started living on the fucking borrowing market. But because of the capitalist economies against the Soviets, they could just show everybody they were the best. There were also impacts on the productivity, and there were also impacts in how things were. But on one side, you had people producing a lot of that shit on credit that at that point wasn't that much of a problem. Fast forward 40, 50 years, you are dealing with guys who are doing everything on credit and telling you, yeah, it's better to borrow instead of having your own cash. Only stupid people have their own cash. Right now, Russia has issues financing itself despite having a way better fiscal health than the rest of the world when it comes to this thing. I'm not saying places like Luxembourg, whatever, but among the big boys, and suddenly it is exactly that the problem. They're isolated, their money got stolen, let's say it like this. And you have this reverse logic where America, which has huge structural problems against China, thinks that we're back to the end of the Cold War and the Chinese are going to break. Whereas when the rest of the world looks like China, unfortunately they see an image of progress, an image of development, an image of production. And on top of it, most of this was enshrined by the West. The electric cars, the smartphones, the IT developments, the AI, all this shit. And suddenly you have a war with some guy who is not fighting you over some bullshit workers' rights or better distribution by the party. No, they're saying we're going to fucking beat you on productivity, on intelligence, on IP, and on standards. Because this is the main difference between the old Cold War, where unfortunately the Soviets were lagging to consumer goods and standards, and the Chinese today. But this logic, and this is what I want to tell you guys, this logic is completely voided by those who are trying to analyze Russia and the West. What they're trying to tell everybody is that the Russians are, and you're going to read it down below. So the immense cost of the conflict have prompted Trump administration as well, and many analysts to assume Russia should want this war to end. Rationally, that makes sense for the country. However, what is driving Putin's approach to this war is not a laser-like focus on Russia's national interest. I just explained to you guys that actually it is in Russia's national interest. Or even on improving the lives of its citizens. Well, there too, there is a problem, because due to the SMO, Putin has chosen to actually play the inflation game with basically Russia's national fund in order for Russian citizens to not feel at least fully the effects of the war. Bonuses, a raise of pay, the MIC Keynesian approach. Anyway, pop, 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 pop. Putin views this war, instead Putin views this war as the latest stage of the century-long Soviet and Russian struggle against the West, as well as essential to cementing his place in history as one of Russia's great leaders. This is nonsense. And it's obvious that it's nonsense. It has nothing to do with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, what they did in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, they tried to get what the Bolsheviks had let go during Brest-Litovsk. They failed to get most of it. Then World War II happens. They are among the winners. They are the big dogs in that war. So they get back as much as they want, plus some extra, plus a buffer. But once you analyze the buffer and the extras that they get, it doesn't get that much better than the Russian Empire prior to World War I. So what exactly is Putin looking for? Is he looking for a far older struggle with the West as the last century? And I think that's what it is. He understands that he is not going to get accepted among the Western club in Europe. With the US, it's completely something different because it is indeed this antagonism and these remnants from the Cold War. I'm ready to accept that, but not with Europe, and not with the way the US is pushing Europe to advance with NATO in tow, to go around Russia and undermine Russia's national interests. When you take out Ukraine from the Russian sphere of influence, with the connections, the history, the culture that are between the countries, we can fucking mock kills for a lot of stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of the fucking perfidy that's happening, especially attacks within Russia, is because they are the same motherfuckers. Adin Narod is not something funny. We laugh about it. But it's also why a lot of shit is happening between both sides. And what this article is coming with is that, in fact, it's not true. There is nothing in common between Russian and Ukrainians. These kinds of falsification of history, this is what's crazy about this kind of articles. And I'm not saying that, because they were together for so long, they must be together. I don't care about that. But the point here is to deny they ever were together. They were close. There are Russian Ukrainian families. There are common leaders. There are leaders born in one side that reign over the other side. It's absolutely nuts. It's a pure historical falsification, and it's exactly what the West has been doing with a lot of countries. So, thus Putin pain and risk tolerance is incredibly high, particularly as there is minimal societal pressure at home. Actually, there is societal pressure at home. The problem is that the Russians are also seeing something else that this article completely avoids. First of all, it avoids the cost for Ukraine. You're going to see down below, they talk about it, but it's not the same. Second of all, they are completely taking out the Russians, the normal Russians agency. While these guys are seeing what Europe is saying about the Russians and what European leaders are saying about the Russians, we have a former Secretary of Defense, British Secretary of Defense, said we need to make Crimea uninhabitable. What the fuck do you want from the Russians when you start saying shit like that? Changing his calculus and Russia's approach on this war will therefore likely require Putin to worry about continuing the war will threaten the security of his reign. Currently, he's not that worried. Actually, if Putin went to war, it is also because of that. War stability for Russia. From an economic perspective, the author's recent analysis demonstrates that Russia can sustain the war in Ukraine for at least 2 to 3 more years. Actually, that's not true. Nobody knows how much Russia is able to sustain the war. We had multiple crises on the Russian side that were pointed out, like they're gonna fucking show how Russia's gonna go down. We have the egg crisis. We have an agricultural crisis. Now we have the fuel crisis. Then we have the pressure on the oil price and stuff like that. Yet the Russians are spending more for war, which has a cost, of course, it's more. But they're still advancing. Low debt, so the Kremlin has upset the collapse of foreign investment, massive state-led spending on military industry complex, a mix of technocratic management, flexible supply chains, low debt levels, support from China, Iran. We go to what I told you guys. Actually, Russia is pretty healthy, so it should be able to afford this war if the sanction regime gets lighter. This war is going places. You need to understand that the sanction regime is making this war what it is right now for most of its part. It needs to be admitted. The problem is that sanction regime is also hurting the other side, but that's something else. Despite mounting economic strains reflecting a widening budget deficit, rising inflation, slowing growth across both civil and industrial sectors, the Kremlin still considers the situation manageable and remains committed to geopolitical confrontation with the West, Ukraine, and beyond. Russia wants to deal with Ukraine because of the West. It doesn't care about Ukraine as it was. Russia and Ukraine were the two faces of the same coin well beyond 2003. The same shitty political manipulations that were happening within the Russian system were double in Ukraine. In a certain sense, if you wanted to see a micro-Russia, you had Ukraine. The graft, the theft, the corruption, the lies, the scamming. Just the same. You can pretend that it was worse. And now it is even worse because it's a different Ukraine you're having in front of you. So the stalled US initiative talks through that Russia economic adaptation to the Western sanctions make unlikely that it offers lift sanctions in order for concessions on Ukraine will succeed. It doesn't matter. Russia wants sanctions lifted because it's still straining, but there is a Faustian bargain here. Lifting sanctions to stop the war, and then within 10 years, everything that Russia didn't want to happen will happen with a brigading of Ukraine within NATO and the EU, and there is nothing Russia will be able to do. Zero. This at least the Russians understood from the mistakes, in my opinion. I didn't consider the mistakes in 2015 because the Russians weren't ready economically to face this kind of pressure through sanctions. But still, now I think they would have tried at least to take the two oblasts, not stop where they stopped. In any case, the threat of Russian asset seizure, nationalization, or resistance from new economic stakeholders, according to the current status quo, is likely to persist, with limited relief akin to the situation Iran faced after partial sanctions relief following the... That also is bullshit, because the sanctions that Russia is facing are completely, I'm going to repeat, completely bypassed. They just do not allow Russia to thrive on a normal manner because it doesn't have the same reach. A large part of the market is off limit for the Russians or under huge constraints, so the price cap and stuff like that. Neither sanctions just extended recession or slow growth economies like to cause. That's once again, they don't know about this. You never know what's going to happen. So on the other hand, certain sanctions might force Kremlin to increase difficult trade-offs. Yes and no. What if, and everybody has had this discussion, what if the Russians just decide to fucking now really mobilize and just drown Ukraine in blood? Then what? Then how are we going to get back into the saddle if the Russians decide to go full on? They lose, really in this case, half 500,000 people, but they are in Dnipropetrovsk. Then what? What about that? How are you going to defend your Ukrainian strategy then? You're not, because that's what Europeans are doing right now, and Americans as well. They're just little cowards hiding behind the Ukrainians to wage a war that they know why they want that war. From military industrial perspective, equipment losses Russia suffered in Ukraine are unprecedented. We go back to the Shahid are going to replace 25 to 40% Russia's tank reserve has been removed from open storage. Most reasonably restored vehicles are depleted. Bullshit. Sharp slowdown in restoration efforts. Russia's reliance on stockpiles is uncertain, with some analysts estimating they could be depleted by the end of 2025. Once again, that's not true. They said it was in summer, but there's something else. In response, Russia has also adjusted its approach, relying on small unit tactics to gradually. That's not true. Russia has not relied on small unit tactics to gradually erode the movement. Russia has relied on firepower to have small unit infiltrate. And again, we're going back to the Shahid bullshit. Overall, though Russia faced military industrial constraints, none look to dramatically alter its larger war effort. Yes, because it's not about small unit tactics and drones. It's about a lot more than that. But once again, we're gonna have the same nonsense on the Western side, because the biggest, I think, miscalculation that the West had is that they weren't thinking that Russia would actually mobilize. They thought that Russia will want to keep its comfort intact, and instead will eat crow early on 2022 and will make amends. And the fact that they seized 300 billion was that they would, by the end of the small war, they thought they would fucking force Russia to lose. Just take it and say, this has reparations, so we're going to take them. And instead, we have the current situation that even if they take them, the damage that's going to be done to Ukraine, just for the spite of it, is going to be far worse than 300 billion. And the parties that are going to try and take it are going to get sued. Well done, Belgium. From a social perspective, Russian public continues to demonstrate resilience in face of economic costs and war casualties on a scale and since World War II. I'm not going to read the rest, because the problem with this is that it completely ignores what the West is showing. The normalcy that they're speaking, the facade of normalcy. It's not normalcy, guys. You set up people from scamming centers to go and blow themselves into places. Russia has done that as well. I'm not trying to pretend that there's innocence. But the moment you see this, the moment you have Ukrainians and Westerners said, you know what, orcs and dead Russians and fertilizer, and you had this song, Vanka Stanka. Like, come on, guys. You cannot try to make this war about inhuman orcs and think that the Russian public is not going to see that. We had the Huns in World War I for the Germans. This is the fucking problem. I'm not saying that this is the same logic, but due to the pervasive presence of social media and means of communication, this war is showing in real time what the other side wants to show about the other side. So it's very difficult for anyone on the West side, especially when you think about NAFO and all that stuff, to pretend that the nice Westerners are so fucking dismayed about the bad Russians. For fuck's sake, the West literally put up straight up outlets to vilify, demonize, and lie about Russia. And it's completely normal. It's war propaganda. Normal in the sense that they were going to do it, not normal that it should be pushed. On top of it, on certain aspects, we at Teamwork Criminal are also partaking to this, because we are mocking the Ukrainians, mocking their failures, berating them, belittling them. It's true that, in my opinion, for our team, it was as a blowback to how the war was presented from the Western point of view. It was a reply, but in the same case, it has gone way beyond that. We have stepped in the same boots as the other side. But I don't care. Because unfortunately, I'm going to repeat, in love and war, everything is fair. They do it, we will do it. An eye for an eye makes everybody blind. I don't give a fuck. The biggest problem with this is that I do not pretend to be peaceful. I do not pretend to find some kind of solution that's going to save the world. No, I had a side to take. That side made a suicidal decision, refused a step to actually making Europe better and better prepared to the next half century and beyond. But we had to be mentally colonized and go with a system and a master. It has become a master now that is literally sacrificing us in order to float. So what the fuck are you even talking about here? Of course I'm going to give shit to all the Nafoids and the Westerners. I don't give a fuck about that. It's my personal decision being completely flabbergasted by the fact that the EU cannot see the major damage it did to itself by trying to get after Russia and turn them into some kind of Iran at our doorstep. It's nuts. But it is what it is. One particular concern is rising inflation. One of Russia's most pressing social problems, we have sanctions, border economic challenges, according to we're passing that. Fuel shortages caused by Ukrainian strikes and Russian refining capacity have direct impact on the Russian public and have burst Russia's sense of normalcy. Actually, that's not true. We already had issues last year, early on last year. This year, the only thing that Ukrainians are managing to do is putting strategic defense back on the table. This will lead the Russians to actually beef up a lot of defenses in the AD. So the next step for the Ukrainians, this is why also they're looking for Tomahawks. They cannot go on blowing one or two units. Those units are going to get repaired. They need to attack them again. They want the big bingo. That's why the Tomahawk is being asked for. Because the Flamingo is bullshit. It's just a pipe dream. And anything else is not going to work for the furthest located refineries. The point is to completely erase these. A bit to what happened to their own mega refinery Kremenchuk. They repair it, Russians send a couple of calibers, it's blown again, it's going to take months if it can be repaired. And then the Russians with the Shahids go after micro refineries, and that's another shit show. Then from demographic standpoint, despite the persistent labor shortage, Russia has so far retained the capacity to mobilize additional manpower for the war by the generous assignment package and so forth, and so on. The Kremlin can still tap into additional labor reserves by optimizing existing deployments such as guard drivers and minor bureaucrats, Soviet legacy, blah, 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 blah. Despite Russia suffering approximately 1 million casualties to date, once again, whatever you're going to say about Russia, this is only worth anything if you also see what's going to Ukraine. War is a tango. You cannot say, oh, Russia is suffering 1 million casualties there, this and that. What's going on with Ukraine? Why is Russia advancing if it's so difficult? Normally they should have stopped. They should have been back to what happened with Kharkov and stuff like that. Instead, the situation is showing, and this is the funny part, that's why the situation on the Ukrainian side is not being shown. Because then you'll have to have a double column accountancy and then say, okay, maybe Ukraine is losing. It remains unclear, however, how long the Kremlin can maintain recruitment at current rate of 30,000-40,000 per month. Early 2025, regional cost rose and stabilized with some drops and new increases began in June. Average volunteer now costs about 2 million rubles, around 23,000 24,000 based on average exchange rate between China, up to 1.5 million early 2025. It is expected to reach 30,000 by year's end, boosting total cost of recruitment to 0.5% of GDP. Once again, when you point this, do not forget, while the cost of recruitment for Russia is high, it doesn't get as much as the cost of death for the Ukrainians. We've made this calculus within the group, and for that I would like to thank Trapped and Kines. All damage payments, if they have to be paid, are over $90 billion. For a real GDP right now, roughly about $120 to $150 billion. And to be honest, probably close to $120 billion, given the huge amount of funding that's being given by the Western partners, which is being also injected within the Ukrainian system, not simply being equipment money for equipment, stuff like, but also just funding and facilitating of payments, stuff like that. Now, possible scenarios. Scenario one, a Russian breakthrough and Ukrainian military collapse. At Timor Criminal, we've ever said we do not expect this unless something grave happens to Ukrainian side, and that thing, I'm telling you right away, is an attack on the bridges, a logistical collapse. But I do not think it's ever going to happen for as long as some things do not happen. And I'm thinking about strategic weapons being given to Ukraine. So Putin appears to be hoping grinding out the Ukrainian forces on the front and eventually overwhelming Ukraine's military. Yet Russia has struggled to make major territorial gains. Losses have been massive. Fresh manpower throws into the fight, lacks the combat training skill necessary to achieve a major breakthrough. This, of course, is false. Why? You know why. Russia put its so-called professional military to test in 2022, and it's true that they gained quite a lot of Ukraine, but they lost quite a lot of what they gained. Since 2022, things have changed, with the drones making an entrance within the war as a major destruction tool, not simply an auxiliary tool. The Ukrainians actually, they are manning most of the front at the first and second line with FPVs and other types of drones, and they're also using the drones now as long-range fire assets, something that the Russians had started initially with the Lancet, and now the Ukrainians have been doing this with a lot of stuff, mainly relying on the Starlink system. So, despite this new threat ecosystem, which makes it extremely more complicated to move and to progress, the Russians have been progressing non-stop since 2023, October 2023. For 2 years within Ukraine, Russia has had the strategic initiative. The Kursk parenthesis regarded Russia, and it was a blessing in disguise given that Ukraine ground up to the losses that were found for so long. Over 10% of what Oryx has found. Over 10% of those losses were in Kursk. We know it's more. It's more probably between 15 and 20% between Kursk and Sumy, with a lot of losses being pulled or being had beyond the line of contact, well within Sumy. The losses, Kia Mia, from losses so far have been, I think we're going to wait for the new losses update, but over 13,000 Kia Mia within the Kursk-Sumy regions. So, based on losses, we are somewhere between 8% of the permanent losses as listed by losses in Kursk for about 7 months. So it's crazy, it's nuts. But on top of it, Kursk was used as some kind of battering ram to try and counterattack stealthily the Russian positions during the same time. What happened, especially from January 2000, actually a bit before, between early December to January, this was a hunch, but by January, given the losses that were starting to pile up, it was clearly a ghost of counter, simply because the situation, the way it was developing, was completely out of control for Ukraine compared to what they had lost always regarding the situation within the previous year. So basically, up until prior to Kursk, Oryx had counted about 6,500 something losses for the Ukrainian side. And after that, what happened was that well, it went to 10,000. So since Kursk up to now, we had the loss in like about 14 to 16 months, depending how you want to count it. We had more than half of what Ukraine had lost from February 2022 to August 2024. So Kursk was the losses catalyst, the destructive force behind the Ukrainian defense logic. So for a lot of people that are going to come at me with, but it's told also the Russians they could have advanced, yes, at the cost that we're seeing today. So Russia hopes that in 2026 forces will begin to have a significant advantage over Ukrainian weakened forces, increasing the rate of Ukrainian attrition and leading to a front collapse or diplomatic capitulation by Kyiv. We know that this isn't going to happen, and this is logical because the Ukrainians have had multiple times the possibility to actually go down to that, and they never did. They actually never did. They refused to sit on the table. They found any kind of bullshit to do it, and the situation that we're having right now is mostly because the Ukrainians are refusing to recognize that their war, the type of war they were wishing to wage against Russia, is backfiring. They are refusing to let go of territory. They're also refusing to actually admit that some of their shortcomings, especially on the ground, are now naked. And they are relying on a line of lies, half-truths, and a lot of PR. And that PR sometimes is extremely problematic. We've had the attacks on the Russian strategic bombers fleet. At the same time, that in June 2025, there were a day before the start of the negotiations with the Russians, the alleged negotiations that were going to give hope to a lot of people. What they gave is just 6,000 trash bags back to the Ukrainians, about 800 square kilometers the next 2 months lost, and more bombs to Ukraine. And once again, this is the problem with these kind of articles, is that they do not regard the lives of Ukrainians. For them, Ukraine, when you read this article, you can understand that Ukraine has no agency. Ukraine will fight because they need to fight. So, furthermore, there is no additional funding for Ukraine in the pipeline. The current deliveries rely on funds allocated during the Biden administration. U.S. approval of requested systems and production priorities also remain in doubt, raising the risk of delays, misalignments, or breakdowns for Ukraine. Europe has picked up some of the slack. They have not. Providing capital to Ukraine's defense industry and buying U.S. weapons to transfer to Ukraine. Yet European military aid is less coherent than U.S. military aid, with many more moving parts, meaning it may not fully offset the reduction in U.S. aid, leaving Ukraine's military in a more vulnerable position. This, of course, is not true. We discussed this. The Europeans can just steal Russian money, and this would actually pave the way for the 2 next years of funding. The problem, as I said, is that once you do that and you couple it with some kind of strategic weapon being given, then Russia will have to go strategic. And then you have that major issue that Ukraine had avoided so far in the escalation ladder, which is starting to lose crossing of the Dnieper, but also started to lose dams. If the Russians really are hell-bent to do it, they will do it. I'm just telling you, if one of the two, Kremenchuk or Kaniv, goes down, you're going to have a huge problem, not with power generation, but with the logic of steps to take to bypass those two dams going down on top of the damage, the ecological damage that's going to happen. Once again, do not forget, a lot of the stuff that hasn't happened in Ukraine is the stuff of nightmares if you are a military planner on the Ukrainian side. There is also the problem with the NPPs. The most recent attempt to the Novoronej NPP when one drone hit a cooling tower should also not make us forget what can happen to Ukraine. Not simply focus on what Ukraine can do, because this is one of the biggest issues, also aided by Western PR. Forever war at lower intensity, this is not going to happen. It makes no sense to go back to the Minsk era non-war. The Ukrainians are on the fucking courts. There is no way Russia's going to relent unless something else happens, and let them rebreathe, regroup, and face a situation like 2021, 4 or 5 years from here. That will happen though, because the Ukrainian leadership cannot let it go, and the Western leadership also cannot let it go. We will have a Azerbaijani logic in this war. And the third part is ceasefire. Russia decided it wants to stop fighting. There are few opportunities for this, a few possibilities, but none of them is present right now in this very moment and is this very trend. It would require a lot more problems. One of those would be that Russia's partners, economical, but also quasi-military, like China, for instance. You need to know that the Chinese, for instance, have tripled the manganese ore exports to Russia in 2025. It's just nuts. There is not any single thing that you can point into the Russia-China relationship right now that doesn't betray the Chinese support for Russia's war. Sometimes they cool it down because the Europeans and the US are pissing them off. But every time, especially with Trump, something happens that makes the Chinese say, fuck this, we're going back to it. And for instance, if you check the Chinese exports on electro-optic system, furniture, parts and body parts for hardened vehicles, matrices for, let's say it as this, for sites and stuff like that, you will be floored, because on top of it, the Chinese are very transparent to what they are exporting. Some things are not that transparent. For instance, there are a couple of engines for the Gerbera drones that are passed as cooling fans and stuff like that, but you start understanding once you see from where those cooling fans are coming. So when people come up and say the Chinese are not helping the Russians, they could do a lot more. If they have to help the Russians militarily the way the Americans are helping the Ukrainians, this war would be a lot funnier for us. But baby steps, guys. And on top of it, there is also a self-esteem on the Russian side. They want to get help, but they're not going to beg for it. So as FAL 205, Russia believes it holds the advantage in the war, and Russian morale has remained relatively positive, particularly after the US support for Ukraine wavered following 2023 when it forced suspension of aid. The election of Donald Trump was initiated as generally be skeptical of US support for Ukraine as further buoyed Russian confidence. That's not true. We can speak about the Tomahawks right now. This strategy for Ukraine relies on the assumption that Russian morale, a vague and loose concept, is fragile, while Russian public generally supports Putin has never fully embraced the rationale for the war. The problem is not the rationale for the war. The problem is that you are trash talking the whole fucking country and are putting sanctions, petty sanctions, that make life for a lot of Russians far more difficult in the hopes that they would go after Putin instead of going after you guys. Unfortunately, there is when you're going to have the Chinese and the rest of the world chiming in by skirting of sanctions, but also by importing goods from China. Now, it's not always good swapping this market, the supply market, because in many cases the Chinese view on Russia is different. So we've had recently issues with Chinese truck being overly competitive price point, but also quality-wise. Remember that some guys told you that the Chinese trucks are the same shit as the Russian one? Apparently that's not the case. Otherwise the Russians wouldn't have gone as far as to ban 3 types of trucks this year. Same for the car industry. The problem with the Chinese cooperation and the Chinese capacity of production for a market like Russia, which is not small but isn't that big either, is exactly that. Once you go mono supplier, that supplier is going to take a hold of you. It should not be all, roses. But the Russians had the same problem with the Europeans. So the issue, though, is that while the Europeans were making joint ventures because those were set up at different times during a peaceful, more relaxed atmosphere, now the Chinese logic is very complicated given that there are sanctions. So the Chinese cannot be seen as doing joint ventures except for certain persons for certain things. So the sanctions here are playing a role of hammer for part of the Russian industry. But once again, I'm going to tell you the same thing is going to happen for a lot of European manufacturers as well. And this is not because China is bad, simply because Europe unprepared itself and created all the hurdles for its own industries and all equipment to be beaten to a pulp. Europe chose electrification while not being ready. It's the same thing for the phones. 15 years ago, Nokia, Ericsson, because before Sony Ericsson, were the big guys. Now just cite me the 3 main brands. And you're going to see that Asia has a huge part in them, be that South Korea as a standalone brand like Samsung, or Apple, who makes a lot of its shit in Asia, despite being American. But they're still I think 15% of the global market, or even less. So once again, I'm trying to tell you guys that the problem that we're having with the Chinese and some kind of Chinese takeover in Russia is the same is going to happen to everybody if you enter in this mono market situation, and that's what it is. That's also the backblast of the sanctions. But this doesn't stop the market from being full. So the problem for the Russians is not the Chinese, or it's not the sanctions, or it's not the lack of money or whatever. or the morale. The problem is that the guys who they are fighting call the Russians, treat the Russians, sanction the Russians, are trying to get the Russians unable to travel. The problem with Europe is not Putin, actually. It's the way they try to make Putin responsible for their actions, for the way they treat the Russians. Basically denying the Russian agency on seeing their own national interests. Scenario 4, peace agreement, a major crisis in Russia, blah, 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 blah. The problem is, though, if there has to be some kind of ceasefire, we will go to a peace agreement. That will, in any case, happen. It's going to be temporary. And Trump, in a certain sense, and Europeans also said, like, whatever it's signed between Trump and Putin, we will not recognize it anyway. So, the ceasefire and the peace agreement are going to be just the same. Just the same. There is nothing else that you're going to see that will change. Conclusion, the war in Ukraine is unlikely to end anytime soon. No shit. US military support for Ukraine is expected to phase out over the next year as deliveries of Biden air are completed. You don't know that. This is bullshit, and that's what we're hearing from Trump. Europe will therefore become primary backer of Ukraine's military. Instead of focusing on developing a peacekeeping force that is highly unlikely to ever materialize, once again, they stopped this idea, so this is already garbage. And it will almost certainly never be accepted by Russia. European leaders should work with Ukraine to develop a multi-year strategy to sustain Ukraine's war effort. Again, there are costs for Ukraine. The costs for Ukraine are very simple, if we need to be honest. Every year they lose at least 60,000 killed in action, of which you need to add between 120 and 150,000 wounded of various capacity. A multi-year of this will hit cohorts that are already low. Unless Ukraine finds a way to mitigate attrition, which they cannot because they incited the war they are fighting right now. Ukraine started to employ, okay, it wasn't Ukraine, the very first FPV drones were some shit from Zala, but the whole FPV mania was taken over by Ukrainians. The FPV changes completely the narrative because it's not a pew-pew war anymore. It's not an artillery war anymore as much as it was before. This means that if you get into the sights of an FPV, you have very little chances to make it. It can happen, but you have a lot less chances than back in the day. This means that on both sides, the losses are going to be extremely high. This investment is needed to sustain frontline forces, protect Ukrainian citizens from missile and drone attacks, and crucially project forces into Russian territory through long-range strikes. Ukraine must also secure sufficient manpower by expanding recruitment and improving frontline rotation to sustain the fight over the long term. I'm going to repeat. Ukraine, as a minimum, is going to lose per year about 180 to 210,000 people as casualties. Half of them probably definitive. On top of this, you need to add all the ecosystem of shit that the Ukrainian army is having, which is AWOL, deserters, but also people who actually are not fighting. If you've seen the TCK scenes, it's not funny for the guys getting grabbed. But those scenes put a lot of people to actually not show up, so force the TCK to do even more of these scenes, flee the country, or desert, or leave their position without leave. However, Ukraine and Europe should also continue to prod the Kremlin to engage in peace talks. How are you going to prod the Ukraine the Kremlin to engage in peace talks when once again you are considering the whole people of Russia with your rhetoric as responsible? Doing so is beneficial for Ukraine's global image as it makes clear to the world who the aggressor is and who stands in the way of peace. The problem is not the aggressor and the defender. The problem is, what's the situation on the ground? It didn't matter that the fucking Taliban were the aggressor. They were in Kabul. It didn't matter that the North Vietnamese were attacking. They were in Saigon. We are going back in circles with this. Trying to make a emotional and political statement about aggressor and defender or whatever is not working. This is why a lot of people told Zelensky this year, take the deal. Achieving a stable outcome to this war, one that allows Ukraine to realize its European dream, would conversely amount to Putin's nightmare. Once again, no, Putin doesn't give a fuck about the RAM state of Ukraine being a burden for Europe. All Putin wants is fucking Ukraine having a micro army, being defanged, so it will not be used as a stepping stone to start a stronger arm Russia into a position where they would have to forego the national interest. In this case, getting their natural wealth stolen or bargained. That's what it is. There are interests within Russia that the Russians want to keep going. They are near abroad, Central Asia, the Arctic. Very difficult to do so with an expanding military alliance who says that they are there only to protect, but they haven't protected anyone so far. Zero. The two most notable interventions from NATO have been to topple a regime in Libya and snatch the province of a country in former Yugoslavia. And I know I'm going to be nasty to a lot of people, to the advantage of the Albanians, for sure. But I don't make the posture. And the same argument has been used by the Russians for Donbass. So if you want to take it to someone, NATO is right there for you guys. So this Russia will have to be pressured militarily, economically, and diplomatically to accept such an outcome. This will take time to achieve, especially since the Kremlin presently appears to believe it can still win the war. Unfortunately, at the moment, the fighting shows no end in sight. So this was the article. It's pretty shitty. What I want to show by all this is that these people, for some reason, when compared to what they were writing even 3 months ago, have changed their tune. For some reason, we are back to a certain logic that regards, as I said, Ukrainians are just cattle that they can be sacrificed to some greater good for some greater situation. And my problem right here is that I just don't get it. Because one thing that was completely void in the article was the losses on the Ukrainian side. And I told you, once you start putting them side to side and say, okay, how many fucking years you want to fight? Multi-year? Then how? Why? Because if you have to fight for 3 years we are already at 3.5, and we already see 160,000 Ukrainians dead that we know of. At the worst case scenario, we would be at least at 600,000 to 700,000 casualties. Out of probably somewhere between 900,000 and 1.1 million people that have at some point been enlisted for action. So for you guys to understand the thing, the best case scenario would be that Ukrainians would have lost 20 to 25% definitely of the forces that at some point were into a combat situation. Doesn't matter where. After 3.5 years, with mobilization and with all the shit. Now fast forward with the recent trend I told you guys. You would be between 1.2 1.4 million casualties, of which 300,000 to 400,000 killed. I'm not saying these are accurate. I'm just pointing out what these guys are asking from Ukraine. That's why this is not in the article. That's why all of these articles non-stop, they aim at Russia, they aim at isolating you from seeing the things in the greater scheme of things. This is why the latest analysis I did over the French kid ended with, just don't lie to yourself. If you need to make the analysis, first of all, look yourself in the mirror. And in this case, looking yourself in the mirror for these people to see how many losses Ukrainians have. The tools are out there. You don't even need to somehow search for long. And it's true that it's not always, the Russians have 6 times, 7 times, 10 times more people, and so the Ukrainians must kill 10 times more guys. No, it's not that simple. But the difference of the known casualties is not there to justify any kind of positive assessment like this. This will take time to achieve. Every day that goes through, Ukrainians lose people. It's not that they stay in their dugouts and they avoid drones and everything's fine. Every single day we got compilation after compilation of Ukrainians getting whacked, droned, bombed, killed, shot, UMPK'd, eaten by dogs. Today there was a pretty fucked up video from Seversk. There was a 5-man platoon or 5-man whatever fire team going through a road to Seversk, getting out into a forest patch that was probably pre-fired, aimed by a Russian tank. That stuff hits right in the middle of the column, and 2 guys that are too close get chopped. The third, which was in the main target, probably gets vaporized whatsoever. And the 2 guys that are, wounded, you see one probably has already bled out, but another guy is still alive. They drop a incendiary bottle right on his face. They cook him. This is every single day. And these guys are saying, oh, you know what? It's going to be fine. Every single day of this, cute, because Russians are dying, so you know what? You're gonna do this for democracy, guys. It's nuts. And I'm the first one to say, I'm not saying this because I care that much about Ukrainians or not. I just am pointing out how fucking shameless these people are. And I'm pretty sure that there is the same kind of cynical approach on the Russian side, because it happens, the war is going on. But the difference is that for these guys, Ukrainians are nothing. Maybe in 10 years they're going to replace Ukrainians with, I don't know, Taiwanese or some other country against a local strategic foe whatsoever. And after that, is maybe going to go back to Ukraine. So this is the beauty of this. My problem is not that Ukrainians are dying or not. My problem is that these people are not honest when they start doing these pieces. Because for them, and I'm going to repeat, for them, Ukrainians dying or Ukrainians fighting, quote unquote, is a condition sine qua non. It's a given that Ukrainians are going to fucking get mogilized and going to get buried into a pit. It's a given that every year 1,000 bags going to fly from a frozen storage direction, a border checkpoint, and be given back to the Ukrainians. It's completely normal that all these people are going to suffer like shit for some revolution of dignity that nobody has defended like this. We saw this with Syria in a certain sense. Impoverishing one side and the other in order to keep the conflict going. And when there is an end to the conflict, we're going to add a couple of more layers of shit with the Zids bombing the Syrians. You can say whatever the fuck you want. I still haven't recovered from the fact that they let a jihadi take over. But then you see the Israelis just go and roll them over in Swaida. You have now fake elections. You have multiple sectarian massacres. You have a quiet insurgency on the coastal areas. You have the Kurds going nuts now. I mean, yeah, these are the people who are now saying that Ukrainians need to keep the democracy by fucking dying on that altar. It's literally blood for a blood god. It's nuts. So yeah, guys, when you regard this kind of paper, when you regard the kind of movements on the map, and the problems that are evident for both sides, but especially for the Ukrainians, you have to understand that there is nothing good coming out of this. And it doesn't matter what you want, what you don't want. It's just going to go to shit. And at some point, once it's gone to shit, the core argument will be, we tried. And a lot of people are going to talk about all the failures of this. Afghanistan literally went to shit. And everybody said like it was going to be on Biden and stuff like that. The moment the war happened in Ukraine, nobody blamed Biden for anything over Afghanistan. And the moment Biden lost, well, actually Kamala lost, but Biden was ousted and Kamala lost to Trump, it was over. Nobody's talking about all the failures within Biden's oversight of the war. And now we're talking about Trump's war. But even if they lose, who the fuck will care? Even for Europe, I'm going to tell you guys, it's not going to be that much because the Europeans will keep their pouting, their sanctions and stuff like that. But at the end, the problem with Europe is that being shortchanged in this war, losing Russia to start getting shit from the other side of the ocean and all the other places in the world, just made everything worse for the structural growth within the continent, but also in the Union. Do you see anyone complain about that? Yes, the business leaders are pointing it out with, a bit of delicacy, but it's ratified. Now what it's needed to be done is spend another 800 billion or whatever to rearm for a war that will never come unless we make it happen. This is the beauty of this. It's 1984 and everybody's sleepwalking to it. But it's not even the 1984 of the book. It's a dystopia of that thing, where we're supposed to be the good guys, but somehow we cannot manage to do good guy things. So either the universe has become bad, or we're not the good guys. And guess what? There are no good guys. There are interests, there are national interests, there are supranational interests, and that's it. It all depends on where you do align. Thank you very much for the attention. And if you guys want to chime in through whatever you want, it's fine with me. Otherwise, yeah. Stay tuned, by the way, for the end of the week, because if things are going the way I'm seeing up north, we might have fun around Kupiansk. But I don't want to jinx it and try to pretend things are already set in stone. Well, it's up to you guys. If you want to add something, question, even contest, once again, I don't really, I'm open to you contradicting me, and I don't know everything. This is my opinion. People who know me, I know that I have never shied away from criticism. So yeah, up to you guys. Okay, sorry if it was a bit longish like last time, shorter but still long. Thank you very much for everything. If everything goes fine, the way I see it, by Friday we will have a recap over the Northern Salient. It's going to be a lot less analytical and a lot more factual. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, guys.